What's it going to take to bring small cars back to our shores? Well, it's no big mystery that the small car has been disappearing. Popular vehicles like the Honda Fit and the Nissan Versa, the Ford Fiesta, the Chevy Spark, they're all gone. And I think that there's 5 things that need to change to bring them back to us. And they're going to be in order of increasing distastefulness. Welcome back to All Cars, y'all. I am John, and I am a fan of small cars, and I hate that they're not out there anymore. They're not popular. As people have moved to SUVs into trucks, cars are selling worse, and while there's some popular cars like the Camry and the Accord and maybe the Sentra that continue to sell well enough, more and more manufacturers are canceling their cars. The Mirage is holding on by its fingernails, and the Versa has recently been canceled as well. But I don't think that it's the end. I think that there's still a place for small cars, but the whole space needs to be revitalized. So like I said, I've got a 5-point plan here. The first one is admittedly 70 to 80% of it. And let's jump into it, because that's number 1. We need to return to function over form. Now, I'm a fan of small cars. Joked for a while there that every car I bought was smaller than the previous one until my Accord out here. And I'm a big fan of how useful they can be. There's no real good soundbite here I can give you, so let me paint a picture for you of what I'm talking about. Back in the 60s and early 70s, American cars were largely huge. Big V8s, maybe, front-engined, rear-wheel drive, transmission, and drivetrain tunnel in the way of your foot with a column-mounted shifter. And then these funny little vehicles started coming along, like the VW Rabbit, and then the Civic, and then the Accord, for example. And there were other examples, but transverse engines, unibody construction, push everything out and opened up the interior. You could have more interior space in a smaller footprint. And most of those had a very open floor plan. There was nothing in between your feet and, well, the next space over. There was no transmission or drivetrain tunnel in the way. It was just open and spacious. Now, admittedly, if you ever stand next to some of those old vehicles, they're incredibly tiny by today's standards, and they're not big inside, but they did feel spacious and open. Now, over time, these vehicles had to become more stylish. People got tired of the Dodge Omnis and the Dodge Colts and the squared-off body styles. Everything needed to start becoming a little more stylish, and certainly crash protection standards played a role as well, increasing the thickness of the pillars for rollover protection, the thickness of the doors for side impact protection, and more smoothing of the exterior for aerodynamics. But what's happened to the small car is they've lost the sense of putting function first. Take a look at the Civic today. I'm going to pick on that for a minute because that's arguably the best small car out there right now, but I don't particularly like it. If you look down the side of it, it's very sculpted. It's turned in. They lean into having it have a more sporty personality, and that impacts the amount of space they have inside. Even the Mirage, let's pick on that for a second. It largely meets what I'm thinking about of being a little more squared off, but they still rounded it so it ends up looking, well, admittedly a little Asian, and smoothing it for aerodynamics, it looks a little goofy, honestly. Add a pretty wimpy 3-cylinder engine and a CVT transmission, and it just doesn't perform that well. And on the inside of modern cars, everybody has to have a center console. Those early cars that were wide open floor plans and had so much space and a sense of space, well, consoles became more and more popular. Look at the modern Civic today, and it's got a big console down the middle of it. In fact, I've been driving my Accord and been thinking recently that it really doesn't have any more space than my Buick of the past, and that was rear-wheel drive. Why? Because my Accord has that big console down the middle of it. Look at huge SUVs. They have huge consoles. Why? Because, well, I think the designers just need to fill the space up and they don't know what to do with it. Now, some manufacturers like Volvo will provide openings down there where you can put stuff. It's incredibly useful. But generally, auto manufacturers over the past decades have made it more and more a styling exercise and forgotten why we moved to front engine to begin with, which was a better utilization of space to provide more passenger space in the cars. So what's the answer? Well, I think we need to have, honestly, a reformation, a retro movement back to putting function before form. More squared off exteriors, more open interiors. I don't think that small cars don't sell because they're just not popular. I think they don't sell because, well, they're dorky looking and they don't really provide any benefit when for a little bit more money you can get something more spacious one size up. And I think there's a few cars out there that really drive home what I'm talking about here. Number one, the Ioniq 5. The Hyundai is absolutely gorgeous. It is my favorite EV probably, and it is squared off and it's super cool looking with lots of little retro touches on the outside. And then inside it's absolutely enormous. The modern EV is providing all of the benefits that we were promised with front-wheel drive combustion engines before. Wide open floors, flat floors, and in this case, the Ioniq has that super cool console that moves in the middle. Now, it's not a small car. It's actually quite large, but it holds to the ethos I'm talking about here of putting that function and the interior space and the openness at the forefront, using a squared off body that has a little bit of retro flair, and it's popular. People love it. Another one I'll give is the VinFast VF3. Now, it's not in America yet, and maybe that's not the best manufacturer to use. However, they introduced the VF3 that was going to come out to other parts of the world. And it's this tiny little two-door hatchback kind of SUV, and it is also electric as well. It's absolutely adorable, not technically being, well, retro to anything we know, but it is absolutely adorable, very reminiscent of that Honda EV that was so popular, even in spite of its short range. It was absolutely adorable, well styled. The VF3 was such a hit, the dealers here in the US started screaming for them to bring it here because they believe it's going to be a sales success. And the last example I'll give is Rivian. Rivian had many months ago introduction. They were bringing out the R2, and as a surprise, they gave everybody the R3. Well, guess which one got a lot of press, and it was the R3 because it looks like an old 80s hatchback small car. In fact, it looks like an old Dodge Omni GLH. It's wonderful and got a ton of attention. So I think there's an appetite out there for smaller vehicles that are styled not retro like an old Thunderbird or a Beetle or the Chevy HHR, but more squared off, maximizing that interior space. That's the majority of what I believe needs to happen to reinvigorate this section of the market. But it comes to number two, changing buying habits. Now, America is the most addicted to financing in the entire world. And part of the problem with a small car is that I could buy a Mitsubishi Mirage, but for a little bit more money, I could have the Nissan Rogue or a Honda CR-V. In fact, I could finance it for 72 months, or hey, I could even lease it and just do away with any of that pesky ownership to begin with. People are not buying their cars, they're renting their cars, and they can get the biggest they can afford. The second part is keeping up with the Joneses. If you buy a Nissan Versa and you drive it home and your neighbor gets a Tahoe, you know they're looking at you and thinking, well, they can't afford anything better than a Versa. Even if you could pay cash for it and not have any payments for the next 7 years, it doesn't matter. You know you're being judged. And that's number three, which is people look at smallish cars, these small cars, and think to themselves, how safe is that really when everyone else on the road drives an SUV? There needs to be a fundamental change in our buying habits of, not financing things forever, of keeping our cars for longer and maybe paying cash for them, putting more down, not trying to keep up with the Joneses and not living in fear of everything else that's out there. But I don't know how to change that directly, except for number 3, which is competition. I will contend that the major manufacturers here in America, Chevy, Ford, Nissan, Honda, Toyota, largely all make variations of exactly the same things. They are hitting the meat of the market with generic egg-shaped white, gray, and black vehicles. It's just a matter of what flavor you like and what the best financing deal is you can find. We need a company or companies to either come in and shake up the market or to have the guts to actually do something different. That's why I celebrate Rivian and Hyundai and VinFast in this situation for doing something a little bit different in the marketplace and trying to make it look just a little bit different. But I do think there maybe needs to be other companies coming in from outside. While Fiat tried to come here, their little rounded cars didn't resonate and don't really do what I'm talking about of certainly look at the 500. It's an adorable car, but for a relatively weak engine that has not great gas mileage, it was also expensive. That's exactly opposite of what I'm talking about here. A company or companies needs to step up and say, look, there's a market. Let's do something different and stand out instead of making variations of all of the same stuff. I will reference here the Ford Maverick. While it's not the small truck that I talk about on the channel, it's a great idea of they have the market to themselves because there's nothing else out there right now. But ultimately, I think that leads us to number 4, which is not everybody's favorite topic, but I think there needs to be a worldwide global recession. It's going to be painful, and it is. I'm not hoping for it, don't get me wrong here, but there's always a downturn. No matter how long the upturn lasts, there's always a downturn, and one will be coming, and part of what comes with that is a shakeup in buying habits. When I talked earlier about the ease of financing and just buy the next biggest thing, well, an economic downturn will shake up people's finances. And these big manufacturers like Ford and Chevy and Toyota that are like, well, I don't need to offer you a small car. Why don't you just buy this SUV? And if you like this SUV, why don't you buy the next biggest one? And pretty soon they're trying to sell you an $80,000 and $100,000 truck. The only thing that's going to fix that, the only thing that's going to stop that is a foundational shift, which comes from a recession. Again, to be clear, I'm not hoping for one, but I am reasonable enough to know it will come at some point. And through that shakeup, what's going to happen? People's finances are going to be squeezed, and they're going to be looking for less expensive vehicles and better fuel economy, or let's say efficiency, depending on what the powertrain actually is. Well, unfortunately, there's a couple of manufacturers who are in place to profit from that. Hyundai, Honda, and Toyota. The rest of them are leaning into the full-size SUVs and trucks, and that's where all their profits are coming from. These manufacturers are here to make profits, and I can't hold that against them, but they are abandoning a section of the market that they will need and will have to scramble once again to get into when a downturn actually happens. And I think that will fundamentally shift us for at least another 10 or 15 years until history repeats itself. And who is ready to take that section of the market will be the one who profits from it. And that leaves us with number 5. And it's with a little bit of a heavy heart to say that we have to be reasonable that, well, the small car market isn't coming back. I know I just did a whole video about it, but bear with me here. I don't think there's a lot of taste out there for people for another Dodge Omni. I may be one of the few, I admit that. But we have to recognize that the market has shifted, and this move to SUVs, CUVs, it's not a fad. It is a fundamental shift that is happening across the world and mostly here in America, with 80% of our sales being SUVs and trucks. there's going to be smaller vehicles. I believe there's going to be a need for these smaller, squared off, almost retro, very, very space efficient vehicles. And that there's a space between a low one that's a car and a tall one that's an SUV. I think there's a space in there, and I want to point to the Chevy Trax. It's not as small as I'm thinking, and it's not as squared as off as I'm thinking, but it's a great example of it's not tall, it's not a car, but it's priced right, and it's really good of space inside, and it's hit the market exactly where it needed to. Compare that with the Ford EcoSport or EcoSport that they used to have. Well, I tended to like it, and it was a small sport utility. It was a sport utility, and it came with the downsides. It was a very tight car inside, back seat, front seat, side to side. It just was not good packaging, not as good as, say, the Honda HR-V, for example. But there is that space that's not a low car and not a tall SUV, where products like the Trax or the Toyota Crown are aiming for right now. So who's the manufacturer that's either going to step up or enter our market with these cool vehicles that puts space utilization at the forefront again, with really cool emphasis on technology, on styling, on standing out from the crowd? Because I believe some of these makes and some of these models have proven there's a market there, but everybody else is just too complacent to risk going after it. Thanks for being here, guys. Let me know what you think below.